A judge frames an innocent black boy for a crime he didn't commit, right there in the courtroom with no lawyer, no parent, and no one to protect him. But when the boy finally speaks up and asks to make just one phone call, everything changes, because the man who picks up isn't just his father. He's the U.S. Attorney General. Within the hour, the courtroom is on lockdown, and the judge's darkest secrets are about to be exposed. How did this child become the target of a system built to break him? And what happens when a father with the full weight of justice behind him decides to fight back? This is a story of corruption, courage, and the power of a son's voice that refused to be silenced. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows of the Jennings, Washington, D.C. home, casting warm shadows across the granite countertops. 6-year-old Amir sat at the breakfast bar, his legs swinging back and forth as he watched his father pack his lunch with careful attention. "Dad, can you tell me the story about Thurgood Marshall again?" Amir asked, his eyes bright with curiosity. He loved hearing about the hero whose face adorned his special lunchbox. Elijah Jennings smiled, his hands pausing over the sandwich he was preparing. Even in his crisp suit and tie, the uniform of the U.S. Attorney General, he moved with the gentle grace of a father who treasured these morning moments with his son. "Well," Elijah began, carefully wrapping Amir's turkey sandwich in wax paper. "Thurgood Marshall was a lot like you, smart, determined, and brave. He believed everyone deserved to be treated fairly." He placed the sandwich in the lunchbox featuring the distinguished face of the first black Supreme Court justice. "Like when he helped kids go to better schools?" Amir asked, remembering his favorite part of the story. "That's right," Elijah nodded, adding apple slices to the lunchbox. "He fought to make sure every child could get a good education, no matter what they looked like or where they came from. That's what justice means, making sure everyone gets treated the right way." From the doorway, Vanessa Jennings appeared, already dressed for her day at the children's hospital where she worked as a pediatrician. "My two favorite men talking about their hero again?" She walked over and kissed Amir on the forehead, then straightened Elijah's tie with practiced ease. "Don't forget about family dinner tonight," she reminded them both. "I'm making your favorite mac and cheese, Amir." Amir's face lit up. "With the extra cheese on top?" Extra cheese," Vanessa confirmed with a wink. Elijah closed the lunchbox with a satisfying click and handed it to Amir. "Remember what we always say?" Amir stood up straighter, his voice clear and proud. "Do what's right, even when it's hard." "That's my boy," Elijah said, pulling him into a warm hug. The drive to school was filled with Amir's excited chatter about the drawing he was working on in art class, a detailed scene of the Supreme Court building he'd visited with his father. As they pulled up to the school entrance, Elijah watched his son hop out of the car, backpack bouncing, lunchbox held carefully in his small hands. Inside Ms. Thompson's first-grade classroom, Amir settled into his usual spot near the window. While other kids clustered together, talking loudly about cartoons and video games, he pulled out his sketchbook and continued working on his drawing. His careful hands traced the columns of the Supreme Court building, adding shadows just like his art teacher had shown them. "What's that supposed to be?" A sharp voice cut through his concentration. Hunter Mathers stood over Amir's desk, his expensive sneakers squeaking on the linoleum floor. Amir didn't look up. "It's the Supreme Court," he said quietly, continuing to draw. Hunter snickered, catching the attention of a few other kids nearby. "Why are you always drawing boring stuff like that?" His eyes fell on Amir's lunchbox. "And what's with that black lawyer guy box? My dad says it's weird." "His name is Thurgood Marshall," Amir corrected politely, just as his father had taught him. "He was a Supreme Court justice." "Whatever." Hunter rolled his eyes, walking away to join his friends who were already laughing. Amir returned to his drawing, adding more detail to the steps where his father had once told him stories about important cases. He didn't mind being different from the other kids. His mom always said being different was what made people special. When the recess bell rang, Amir carefully put away his drawing and headed to his cubby to get his lunch. but when he reached inside, his fingers found empty space where his lunchbox should have been. A small frown crossed his face as he looked around, checking the floor and nearby cubbies. "Mrs. Martinez," Hunter's voice suddenly rang out across the classroom. "Amir stole my lunch." The classroom went quiet. All eyes turned to Amir, who stood confused by his cubby, still holding his empty Thurgood Marshall lunchbox. Mrs. Martinez, the recess monitor, hurried over, her face stern. "He took my sandwich and my cookies," Hunter continued, pointing at Amir. "I saw him do it." Amir's heart beat faster, but he didn't cry. He held his empty lunchbox close to his chest, looking up at Mrs. Martinez. "I didn't," he said softly but clearly. "My lunch is missing too." But Mrs. Martinez wasn't listening. She was already reaching for Amir's hand. "Come with me, young man. We're going to see Principal Stevens right now." As Mrs. Martinez led him toward the door, Amir caught a glimpse of Hunter's satisfied smirk. He clutched his empty lunchbox tighter, feeling the raised outline of Thurgood Marshall's face under his fingers. His father's words echoed in his mind. Do what's right even when it's hard. He walked quietly beside Mrs. Martinez, his head held high despite the whispers of his classmates behind him. He didn't cry or protest. He just held onto his lunchbox, thinking about the stories his father had told him about standing up for what was right, even when others tried to make you feel wrong. The hallway to the principal's office seemed longer than usual, but Amir's steps remained steady. He was his father's son, after all, and he knew the truth would come out eventually. It always did. That's what justice meant. Principal Langston's office felt cold despite the afternoon sun streaming through the Venetian blinds. Amir sat in an oversized leather chair, his feet barely touching the ground, while Mrs. Martinez stood by the door with her arms crossed. The empty Thurgood Marshall lunchbox remained clutched in his small hands. Principal Langston settled into his creaking desk chair, pulling out a sheet of paper covered in messy handwriting. His reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose as he cleared his throat importantly. "Now then," Langston began, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "I have here a statement from Hunter Mathers. He says you took his lunch from his cubby when no one was looking." He peered at Amir over his glasses. He describes his missing lunch in detail: a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, chocolate chip cookies, and an apple juice box. Amir sat up straighter, his voice small but clear. "But sir, my lunch was—" "I'm not finished." Langston cut him off, holding up a hand. "Hunter is an excellent student from a very respected family. He has no reason to make up stories." He shuffled some papers on his desk, not meeting Amir's eyes. "This kind of behavior is very serious." "My lunch disappeared first." Amir tried again, his fingers tracing the embossed face on his lunchbox. "I was looking for it when Hunter—" "Young man," Langston interrupted again, his voice sharp. "The evidence is quite clear." He reached for his phone, and Amir's heart lifted slightly. Surely he was calling his parents. They would understand. They would explain. But instead of dialing the Jennings household, Langston pressed a different number on his speed dial. "Officer Reed? Yes, we have a situation here that requires your attention. Yes. A theft, actually. No need to wait, if you could come right away." Amir's stomach twisted into knots as he realized what was happening. He'd seen Officer Reed around school before, a tall man with a stern face who sometimes gave talks about staying out of trouble. The way Principal Langston was speaking made it sound like Amir was some kind of criminal. The minutes ticked by slowly on the wall clock. Amir sat perfectly still, just as his father had taught him to do in important meetings. He wanted to speak up again, to explain about his missing lunch, but every time he opened his mouth, either Langston or Mrs. Martinez would shush him with a stern look. Exactly 15 minutes later, heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Officer Reed entered the office, his police uniform crisp and imposing. He barely glanced at Amir before turning to Principal Langston. "What's the situation here?" Reed asked, his hand resting casually on his belt near his handcuffs. "Theft of another student's property," Langston replied, handing over Hunter's statement. "The victim is quite distraught." Officer Reed skimmed the paper quickly, then turned to Amir. His voice was gruff and intimidating. Did you take the lunch?" "No, sir," Amir responded quietly. "My lunch was—" "Speak up," Reed demanded, "and look at me when you're talking." Amir raised his eyes to meet Reed's stern gaze. "No, sir, I didn't take anything. My own lunch was missing and—" "So you admit you were looking through the cubbies?" Reed interrupted, twisting Amir's words. "No, I was just—" "He's been quite uncooperative," Langston interjected from behind his desk. "We've noticed some concerning behavioral issues developing lately." Amir's eyes widened at this lie. He'd never been in trouble before, had never even been sent to the principal's office until today. But before he could protest, Officer Reed was speaking again. "Listen, son," Reed said, though his tone held no warmth. "Things will go better for you if you just tell the truth. Did you get hungry and take someone else's lunch?" "No," Amir whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "I brought my own lunch. It had turkey and apple slices. My dad packed it this morning." "Still making excuses," Reed sighed, reaching for his handcuffs. "You kids never learn." The metal clicked cold and heavy around Amir's small wrists. His beloved lunchbox clattered to the floor as Officer Reed pulled him to his feet. The face of Thurgood Marshall stared up at him from where it lay on the carpet, and Amir felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He blinked them back, remembering his father's words about staying strong. "What about my backpack?" Amir asked, looking at his bag still sitting by the chair. "Leave it," Reed ordered, steering him toward the door. "We'll deal with that later." They didn't use the main hallway. Instead, Reed led him through a back corridor that emptied into the staff parking lot. Amir could hear children laughing at recess somewhere in the distance. As they approached the police cruiser, Amir gathered his courage. "Can I call my mom or dad?" Reed didn't even look down at him. He opened the back door of the cruiser and helped Amir inside, being careful of his head despite the rough handling moments before. The door closed with a heavy thunk, and Amir found himself alone in the back seat, the handcuffs digging into his wrists. Through the window, he could see Principal Langston watching from his office window, the Venetian blinds creating striped shadows across his face. The principal turned away quickly when he caught Amir looking at him. The car's interior was hot in the early afternoon sun. Amir sat perfectly still, his father's lessons about encountering law enforcement playing through his mind. Stay calm, be respectful, know your rights. But he was only 6 years old and no one had read him his rights. No one had called his parents. No one had listened when he tried to tell his side of the story. Officer Reed slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. As they pulled away from the school, Amir watched his empty Thurgood Marshall lunchbox grow smaller and smaller in the window, abandoned on Principal Langston's office floor. The police cruiser wound through the streets of Washington, D.C., each turn taking Amir further from his school and everything familiar. He watched the trees blur past his window, their branches swaying in the afternoon breeze. The handcuffs felt heavy on his small wrists, and though he tried to sit still, every bump in the road made them dig into his skin. Officer Reed drove in silence, occasionally glancing at Amir in the rearview mirror. The boy's reflection showed a calm exterior, but a single tear escaped and rolled down his cheek. He quickly wiped it away with his shoulder, not wanting the officer to see. After 30 minutes that felt like forever, they pulled up to a stark building with high fences. A sign read, Millstone Juvenile Detention Intake Center. The concrete walls looked cold and uninviting against the warm afternoon sun. "Let's go," Reed said gruffly, opening Amir's door. He guided the boy through a series of heavy metal doors, each one closing with a loud clang that made Amir flinch. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as they approached a processing desk. A tired-looking woman with glasses hanging from a chain around her neck barely looked up from her computer. "New intake," Reed announced, pushing a form across the desk. 6-year-old male caught stealing at Jefferson Elementary. The woman's eyes flickered to Amir, showing a brief moment of surprise at his age, but she quickly returned to her professional demeanor. "Standard processing," she said, reaching for a fingerprinting pad. Amir stood quietly as they pressed each of his small fingers into the black ink, then rolled them onto a card. His hands looked tiny against the adult-sized spaces on the form. The ink felt sticky and cold on his skin. "Wash up over there," the woman pointed to a sink in the corner. Amir had to stand on his tiptoes to reach the faucet, scrubbing at the stubborn ink that wouldn't completely come off. Meanwhile, Officer Reed sat at a nearby desk typing rapidly on a computer. His report painted a very different picture from what had actually happened. Subject resisted being escorted from the principal's office, created a disturbance during transport, displayed defiant attitude and refused to cooperate, demonstrated concerning behavioral patterns. The lies filled the screen, but Amir couldn't see them from where he stood, still trying to clean his hands. A clerk in a navy blue uniform approached with more paperwork. "Hearing scheduled for tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., she said, showing Reed the form. "Judge Matthews has the rotation." Reed nodded, finishing his report. The clerk moved to a phone at the desk, picking up Amir's file. "Better notify the parents," she muttered, dialing the emergency contact number listed. The phone rang several times before an automated voice announced, "The number you have reached is no longer in service." It was Vanessa's old cell phone number, changed months ago but never updated in the school system. The clerk shrugged, made a note in the file, and moved on to her next task without leaving any message or trying alternate numbers. "This way," a different guard said to Amir, leading him down a long hallway to a holding room. Inside, 2 older boys sat on metal benches attached to the wall. They looked up as Amir entered, their eyes widening at the sight of such a young child. One boy, maybe 12 or 13, whispered something to his friend, and they both stared at Amir like he was an alien who had landed in their midst. Amir found a spot on the opposite bench, making himself as small as possible. His heart pounded, but he remembered his father's words about staying calm in difficult situations. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the minutes crawled by. The older boys continued to stare, occasionally whispering to each other. Amir focused on counting the tiles on the floor, trying to keep his mind occupied. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, another guard appeared at the door. "Jennings," he called out, checking a clipboard. "Time for your cell assignment." Amir stood up, his legs shaky from sitting so long. The guard led him through more corridors, past rows of cells with heavy metal doors. They stopped at one near the end. "In you go," the guard said, unlocking the door. The cell was small and dim, with a narrow bunk attached to the wall and a metal toilet in the corner. The concrete walls were bare except for a few scratches where previous occupants had carved their names. Amir stepped inside, turning around quickly as the guard prepared to close the door. "Can I talk to my dad?" he asked, his voice small but clear in the empty cell. The guard paused, key in hand. He looked at Amir for a moment, then shrugged. "Tomorrow, maybe," he said, closing the door with a heavy clang. The cell was cold, and the thin mattress on the bunk did little to ward off the chill. Amir climbed up, his shoes barely making a sound on the metal frame. He curled up on his side, facing the wall, and finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. His dad had always taught him about justice, about standing up for what was right. But now, for the first time, Amir wondered if justice worked the same way for everyone. He thought about his Thurgood Marshall lunchbox, still lying on Principal Langston's office floor, as empty as his stomach felt now. In the darkness of his cell, Amir hugged his knees to his chest and tried to make himself as small as possible. The sounds of the detention center echoed through the halls, distant voices, doors closing, keys jangling. He squeezed his eyes shut and tried to imagine he was somewhere else, anywhere else, but the cold reality of the concrete walls kept bringing him back to where he was. The first rays of morning light barely filtered through the narrow window of Amir's cell when heavy footsteps echoed down the corridor. Keys jangled, and the metal door scraped open with a harsh sound that made him jump, his heart racing instantly. "Up!" a guard commanded, flicking on the harsh fluorescent light that burned Amir's tired eyes. "Breakfast." Amir uncurled himself from the thin blanket, his body stiff and aching from the hard mattress that might as well have been concrete. The guard thrust a paper bag and a small plastic cup of water at him, not bothering to wait and see if he took it properly. Inside the bag was a dry, packaged muffin that crumbled as soon as he touched it, breaking apart like sand between his fingers. The cell felt even colder in the morning light. the chill seeping into his bones. Amir's stomach growled painfully, but the muffin tasted like cardboard in his mouth, dry and flavorless. He managed a few small bites and sipped the water, which had a strange metallic taste that made him wince. No one spoke to him or asked if he wanted more. No one seemed to care if he ate at all. Before he could finish the meager breakfast, different guards appeared at his cell door, their expressions blank and unreadable. One held a pair of handcuffs that looked enormously out of place, designed for adult wrists, not a child's. They looked enormous compared to Amir's small wrists. "Time to go," the guard said gruffly, his voice echoing in the small space. "Hold out your hands." The metal was ice cold against Amir's skin as they locked the cuffs in place, the sharp edges digging into his flesh. They were so big they slid around his wrists, making soft clinking sounds with every tiny movement, a constant reminder of his situation. The guards led him through a maze of gray corridors, their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls like distant thunder. Outside, a white van waited in the morning chill, its engine running with a low rumble. It had no windows except for the ones in front, and the back compartment was separated from the driver's area by a metal grate that reminded Amir of animal cages he'd seen at the zoo. One guard opened the heavy back doors, while another helped Amir climb in, his hands awkwardly supporting himself with the oversized cuffs. The van's interior was bare metal with only a hard bench bolted to each wall, not a hint of comfort to be found. Amir sat down, the oversized cuffs making it difficult to balance as the van lurched forward. The ride was bumpy, each pothole sending a jolt through his body, and without windows, he couldn't tell where they were going or how much time had passed. The metal bench was cold through his clothes, seeping through the thin fabric, and every turn sent him sliding slightly despite his efforts to stay still, his small body fighting to find stability. After what felt like forever, the van slowed to a stop, the brakes squealing slightly. When the doors opened, Amir found himself looking at the imposing facade of the Jefferson County Courthouse. The building stretched up into the morning sky like a mountain, its stone columns casting long shadows across the steps, making it look even more intimidating. The guards helped him down from the van, their hands firm on his shoulders as they guided him up the courthouse steps. Inside, their footsteps echoed off marble floors as they made their way to courtroom 3B, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings. The hallway was mostly empty, their small group passing only a few early morning workers who barely glanced their way, as if the sight of a handcuffed child was nothing unusual. The courtroom doors opened to reveal a space that seemed designed to intimidate, to make people feel small and powerless. Dark wood paneling covered the walls, and the judge's bench loomed high above the floor like a throne. Unlike regular courtrooms Amir had seen on TV, there were no rows of seats for spectators, just empty space and heavy silence that pressed down on him. Judge Helbrake sat at his bench, already looking irritated despite the early hour, his mouth set in a permanent frown. His black robe seemed to absorb what little warmth the room held, and his expression darkened further when he saw Amir, his eyes narrowing with something like disgust. A young black bailiff named Deshawn stood near the judge's bench, his uniform crisp and neat. His eyes widened when he saw Amir, taking in the child's small size and the oversized handcuffs that threatened to slip off his wrists with each tiny movement. Deshawn took a half-step forward, his face showing concern that he quickly tried to mask, but Judge Helbrake waved him back with an impatient gesture, as if swatting away a fly. "Proceed," Helbrake said, not bothering to look up from the papers on his desk, his voice carrying the weight of boredom and annoyance. A prosecutor in a wrinkled suit stepped forward, holding Officer Reed's report in hands that hadn't bothered to smooth the pages. He read in a monotone voice, reciting the fabricated account of Amir's resistance and behavioral issues as if reading a grocery list. The words echoed in the empty courtroom, each false accusation hanging in the air like smoke, impossible to wave away. Judge Helbrake sighed heavily, finally looking up from his desk to give Amir a dismissive glance, as if he were nothing more than an inconvenience in his day. "Another one," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear, the words dripping with contempt. "Always the same story." Deshawn shifted uncomfortably at his post, his hands clasped tightly behind his back until his knuckles turned white. His eyes kept moving between the judge and Amir, watching the injustice unfold but powerless to intervene, his jaw clenching with each passing moment. Halbrake leaned forward in his chair, his expression a mixture of boredom and contempt, the leather creaking beneath his weight. "Do you understand what you've done?" he asked Amir, his tone suggesting he didn't really care about the answer, just going through the motions. Amir looked up at the towering bench, feeling smaller than he ever had before, his voice barely above a whisper but somehow still clear in the silent room. "I didn't do anything," he said, his words clear despite their softness, tinged with confusion and fear. "Can I call my dad now?" A smirk crossed Halbrake's face, ugly and knowing, like he was enjoying a private joke. "You think that'll save you?" he asked, but then waved his hand in a gesture of mock generosity, as if bestowing a great favor. "Go ahead, make your call." Deshawn stepped forward with a desk phone, placing it where Amir could reach it despite his handcuffs, his movements gentle and careful. The judge watched with amused expectation, leaning back in his chair, clearly anticipating nothing would come of this small allowance, his eyes glittering with cruel satisfaction. Amir's fingers trembled slightly as he carefully pressed each number from memory, the phone feeling enormous in his small hands. The phone rang once, twice, the sound deafening in the quiet courtroom, and then his father's familiar voice answered, strong and clear. "Elijah Jennings speaking." "Daddy?" Amir's voice quivered, a sudden rush of relief washing over him at the sound of his father's voice. "It's me. I need help." The silence in the Department of Justice conference room was heavy with concentration as senior officials reviewed complex terrorism reports. Elijah Jennings sat at the head of the long mahogany table, his attention focused on the presentation before him. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across stacks of classified documents and half-empty coffee cups. A soft knock interrupted the briefing. Elijah's assistant, Maria, stepped inside, her face tight with concern. She rarely interrupted these high-security meetings. It was an unspoken rule, but something in her expression made Elijah straighten in his chair. "I apologize for the interruption, sir," Maria said, her voice careful and measured. "There's a call on line 1. It's Amir." The name cut through the formal atmosphere like a knife. Elijah's hand was already reaching for the phone before Maria finished speaking. The other officials exchanged glances. They knew about Amir, had seen pictures of the Attorney General's young son on his desk. "Elijah Jennings speaking," he answered, his tone steady despite the worry building in his chest. "Daddy?" The small, trembling voice on the other end made his heart stop. "It's me. I need help." Elijah's fingers tightened on the receiver. "Amir? Where are you, son?" "They say I stole something. I didn't." Amir's voice shook. "I'm in a courtroom." The words hit Elijah like physical blows. His son. A courtroom. The pieces didn't fit. Couldn't fit. But years of legal training kicked in, pushing personal panic aside. "Listen to me carefully, Amir," he said, keeping his voice calm and warm. "I'm coming right now. Don't say anything else to anyone. I'll be there very soon." He hung up and stood in one fluid motion. The room had gone completely still, every face turned toward him. But Elijah was already moving, his mind racing through procedures and protocols. "Maria," he called, and she appeared instantly at his side. "I need everything you can find on Amir's location in the last 24 hours. School records, security footage, everything. And get me Judge Carlton from the Federal Circuit on the phone." His team sprang into action like a well-oiled machine. Years of handling national security crises had prepared them for rapid response, though none had expected to use those skills for this. In the corridor outside, phones started ringing. Keyboards clattered. Voices rose and fell with urgent commands. Elijah strode toward his office, his long legs eating up the distance. Behind him, his chief of staff, Marcus, was already on his phone. "I need a trace on a courthouse call that just came into the AG's direct line," he was saying. "Priority 1 clearance." Inside his office, Elijah grabbed his coat while scanning the incoming information on his tablet. His security detail was already assembling, their faces set with professional concern. "Sir," one of his legal advisors called from the doorway, "We've located him. Jefferson County Courthouse, Courtroom 3B, Judge Leonard Halbrake presiding." The name sparked recognition. Halbrake, known for his harsh sentencing of minority youth, particularly in cases involving minor infractions. Multiple complaints filed, all mysteriously dismissed. "Initiate a federal oversight flag," Elijah commanded, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos. "Code 42J, potential civil rights violation involving a minor." The order rippled through the office. The federal oversight flag was rarely used, a powerful tool that allowed immediate Department of Justice monitoring of state-level proceedings. In minutes, every action in that courtroom would be under federal scrutiny. Elijah's security detail had already cleared the corridor. 4 black SUVs idled in the underground parking garage, engines humming. Agents spoke quietly into their earpieces, coordinating routes and security protocols. In the lead vehicle, Elijah sat straight-backed as his team briefed him. The city streets blurred past the tinted windows. His Deputy Attorney General, Sandra, read from her tablet. "Amir was taken from his school yesterday," she reported, her voice tight with controlled anger. "No parental notification, no proper processing. He was held overnight at Millstone Juvenile Detention." Elijah's jaw clenched. Millstone, another facility with a troubling record of civil rights complaints. "The alleged incident involved a missing lunch," another official added. "No evidence was collected, no witnesses interviewed. The arresting officer, Reed, has 3 pending investigations for excessive force against minority suspects." The motorcade moved swiftly through traffic, lights flashing silently. Other vehicles pulled aside, unaware of the storm of federal authority bearing down on a small county courthouse. "Judge Halbrake's record," Sandra continued, her tablet casting a blue glow on her face. "Last year alone, 89% of his juvenile defendants were children of color. Average sentence length triple that of his peers. Multiple complaints of refusing proper representation and due process." The courthouse came into view, its stone facade now bathed in mid-morning sun. The motorcade swung around to the side entrance, where 2 local officers stood frozen in surprise at the sudden arrival of federal power. Inside, past those doors, Amir was waiting. Elijah pictured his son's face, remembered their breakfast together just yesterday. Was it only yesterday? The Thurgood Marshall lunchbox, the talk about justice, the promise of family dinner. The SUVs pulled to a stop in perfect formation. Agents emerged first, securing the area with practiced efficiency. Sandra stepped out, already coordinating with local authorities through her earpiece. The courthouse staff gathered at windows, watching the unusual scene unfold. Elijah straightened his tie, checked that his DOJ credentials were visible. In his mind, he was both father and attorney general, personal anguish wrapped in constitutional authority. He thought of Thurgood Marshall, whose picture had smiled from Amir's lunchbox. Equal justice under law wasn't just a phrase carved in marble, it was a promise he had made to his son and to every American child. The side door opened. Elijah stepped out into the morning light, his face composed, but his eyes holding the weight of generations of fathers who had faced similar moments. Behind him, the power of the federal government stood ready. Before him, through these doors, his 6-year-old son sat alone in a courtroom, legs too short to reach the floor. Judge Halbrake waited in his chambers, unaware that his small fiefdom was about to meet the full force of federal oversight. In the courtroom, Amir perched on the too-big chair at the defendant's table, the empty Thurgood Marshall lunchbox still clutched in his small hands. Deshaun stood at attention beside the heavy courtroom doors, his hand resting on the polished brass handle. Judge Halbrake's voice crackled through his earpiece. "Bring the defendant back in." The young bailiff took a deep breath, troubled by the memory of the small boy sitting alone at that massive table. This wasn't right. None of it was right. He pulled the door open, ready to announce the resumption of proceedings, but the words died in his throat. Through the doorway strode Elijah Jennings, his presence filling the corridor like a gathering storm. The U.S. Attorney General moved with purposeful grace, his expertly tailored suit a stark contrast to the courthouse's worn furnishings. Behind him, federal agents in dark suits spread out with quiet efficiency, their badges catching the fluorescent light. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Even the usual creaks and whispers of the old building seemed to hold their breath. Deshawn stepped back, his training warring with his relief at this unexpected intervention. At the defendant's table, Amir's eyes widened at the sight of his father. The boy's small hand still clutched his Thurgood Marshall lunchbox, his knuckles white against the metal surface. A spark of hope lit his face, but he remained quiet, watching the scene unfold with the same careful observation he'd shown throughout his ordeal. Judge Halbrake burst from his chambers, his face flushing red beneath his thinning hair. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" he demanded, rising from his chair. The wooden seat scraped against the floor, the sound harsh in the tense quiet. Elijah raised one hand, the gesture both peaceful and commanding. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of federal authority tempered with years of constitutional law. "This hearing is now under emergency federal review," he announced, each word precise and measured. "I am invoking Department of Justice oversight under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act." The Attorney General reached into his suit jacket, producing his federal credentials with practiced ease. "I require an official court recorder immediately," he continued, his tone brooking no argument. "All proceedings from this point forward will be documented in full." Deshawn moved quickly to the phone, grateful for something useful to do. His fingers shook slightly as he dialed the recorder's office. Behind him, he could hear the soft rustle of movement as federal agents positioned themselves around the courtroom's perimeter. Elijah crossed the worn carpet to where his son sat waiting. The Attorney General's public persona melted away as he knelt beside Amir's chair, bringing himself to eye level with his child. His hand came to rest gently on Amir's shoulder, and Deshawn noticed how the boy's rigid posture softened just slightly at his father's touch. "Are you hurt?" Elijah asked softly, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. The question held layers of meaning: physical pain, emotional trauma, the deeper wounds that such injustice could leave on a young soul. Amir shook his head, his voice small but steady. "No, Daddy, but they said I lied." His words hung in the air, a child's simple truth cutting through the legal complexity around them. "You didn't," Elijah assured him, his certainty absolute. "I know you." The exchange was private despite their audience. A father's faith in his son laid bare before the court. Rising slowly, Elijah turned to face Judge Halbrake. The Attorney General's expression hardened, though his voice remained controlled. "In 17 years of practicing law," he stated, each word deliberate and sharp, "I have never seen a child railroaded this fast with this much silence around him." He took one step forward, his presence seeming to grow with the movement. "That ends today." Judge Halbrake sank back into his chair, his earlier bluster evaporating under Elijah's steady gaze. The judge's hands gripped his armrests, knuckles white against the dark wood. His authority, so absolute just moments before, crumbled in the face of federal oversight. Around the courtroom, DOJ agents moved with quiet efficiency. Camera shutters clicked as they documented the scene, paying special attention to the files spread across the clerk's desk. One agent approached the court clerk, who sat frozen at her computer. "We'll need the last 5 years of juvenile sentencing logs," the agent stated, presenting official documentation. All of them, including sealed records. Deshawn watched as another agent examined the hastily assembled file on Amir's case, noting every procedural violation, every missing signature, every rushed timestamp. The young bailiff felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The truth he'd been unable to voice was finally coming to light. The court recorder hurried in, setting up her equipment with practiced speed. Her fingers hovered over the keys, ready to capture every word of what was quickly becoming a landmark moment in Jefferson County's judicial history. Through it all, Amir remained at the defendant's table, his father standing protective beside him. The boy's eyes moved from person to person, taking in the scene with quiet intensity. His Thurgood Marshall lunchbox sat before him on the table, no longer just a container for food, but a symbol of the justice system's highest ideals and its deepest failings. The morning sun slanted through the high windows, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. In those shadows, federal agents continued their work, methodically documenting years of questionable practices and rushed judgments. Judge Halbrake sat rigid in his chair, watching as his carefully constructed world of unchecked authority began to unravel in the harsh light of federal scrutiny. In a dimly lit security monitoring room tucked away in the courthouse's basement, Mr. Darrell stood before a wall of flickering screens. His weathered hands rested on the metal desk as he watched the scene unfolding in courtroom 3B. The morning's usual quiet had erupted into controlled chaos as DOJ agents moved through the space with determined precision. Through the grainy footage, he observed Judge Halbrake's transformation from towering authority to cornered prey. The sight stirred something deep in Darrell's chest, a mix of vindication and regret that made his heart beat faster. For 15 years, he'd witnessed Halbrake's swift justice from the shadows, watching countless young lives derailed before they'd barely begun. Darrell's fingers drummed against the desk, a nervous rhythm that matched his racing thoughts. The security monitor showed federal agents requesting files, their badges flashing under the fluorescent lights. But Darrell knew they wouldn't find everything, not the real evidence, not yet. He straightened his Navy maintenance uniform, checked that his ID badge was secure, and made his decision. With practiced quiet, he moved through the service corridors he'd walked for over a decade. The rubber soles of his work boots made no sound on the worn linoleum floors. At the end of a seldom-used hallway, Darrell stopped before a heavy metal door marked Maintenance Archive. The paint was peeling around the edges, revealing layers of older colors beneath. His hands trembled slightly as he sorted through his massive ring of keys, selecting a tarnished brass one that looked as old as the building itself. The lock turned with a solid click that echoed in the empty corridor. Darrell glanced over his shoulder, an instinct born from years of careful observation, before slipping inside. The room smelled of dust and forgotten papers, the air thick with the weight of buried secrets. Moving with purpose now, Darrell crossed to the far corner where cleaning supplies were stacked in neat rows. He shifted a metal shelf with practiced ease, revealing a section of flooring that looked identical to the rest, almost. Using a flathead screwdriver from his pocket, he pried up the false board he'd installed years ago, back when he'd first started documenting Halbrake's dealings. 3 cardboard boxes lay nestled in the shallow space, protected from moisture by careful wrapping. Darrell lifted them out one by one, his movements gentle despite their worn appearance. These boxes represented years of patient observation, countless extra hours spent cleaning after everyone else had gone home, listening and watching as Halbrake built his empire of corruption. The first box contained copies of sealed juvenile cases, hundreds of them, each featuring the same pattern of rushed hearings and harsh sentences. Darrell had carefully photocopied them late at night, using the ancient machine in the clerk's office while the building slept. The second box held his handwritten notes, dating back to his first year at the courthouse. Every suspicious conversation, every pattern of discrimination, every child who disappeared into the system without proper representation, all documented in his neat, precise handwriting. But it was the third box that made his hands shake as he opened it. Inside lay a private ledger, its pages filled with numbers that told an ugly story. Kickbacks from private juvenile detention centers, carefully hidden behind shell companies but all leading back to Halbrake's signature. The judge had built a profitable pipeline, turning children's lives into dollars with the bang of his gavel. Beneath the ledger, wrapped in a clean maintenance rag, lay a small flash drive labeled simply, Insurance. Darrell picked it up, feeling its weight, so light, yet heavy with evidence. Security footage, recorded conversations, scanned documents, years of digital proof that he'd collected, always hoping someone would come who could use it. He tucked the drive into his jacket pocket and returned the boxes to their hiding place. The floor panel went back into place, the shelf returned to its position, erasing all signs of disturbance. Darrell straightened his uniform again, a habit born of pride in his work before stepping back into the hallway. Above, he could hear the movement of people through the building, the unusual energy of the federal investigation spreading through every floor. Darrell made his way toward courtroom 3B, using the service corridors he knew better than anyone. He emerged into a side hallway just as Attorney General Jennings stepped out of the courtroom. Darrell's heart pounded as he approached the tall, distinguished man. He'd seen Elijah Jennings on television, of course, but his presence in person carried even more authority. The Attorney General turned at his approach, his expression attentive despite the chaos around them. "Excuse me, sir," Daryl said softly, his voice carrying the weight of years of silence. "You don't know me, but I've been watching him ruin kids for years." He glanced around before continuing, making sure they weren't overheard. Thought no one would ever come. Elijah studied him carefully, noting the maintenance uniform, the years of service pins, the quiet dignity in the older man's bearing. Without a word, Daryl reached into his jacket and withdrew the flash drive. "Everything's here," he explained, his voice barely above a whisper. "Footage, documents, proof of kickbacks from the detention centers. Been collecting it since I started, hoping somebody would finally look closer." Elijah took the drive, understanding immediately its significance. His expression remained composed, but his eyes sparked with controlled intensity. "You just gave this case teeth," he said quietly, tucking the drive securely into his inner suit pocket. Inside the courtroom, a clerk approached Judge Halbrake's bench with swift steps. Her heels clicked against the floor as she handed him a folded note. The judge's hands were no longer steady as he opened it, reading the simple message. "A. G. Jennings requests a private chambers meeting. Now." Halbrake's face twitched, a muscle jumping in his jaw. The color drained from his features as he looked up, his gaze meeting Elijah's across the courtroom. For the first time since anyone could remember, Leonard Halbrake looked scared. The facade of judicial authority crumbled entirely, leaving behind only a man who knew his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. Judge Leonard Halbrake's chambers had always felt like his personal fortress. Dark wood paneling lined the walls, and heavy law books filled built-in shelves, all carefully arranged to project authority and gravitas. But today that carefully constructed atmosphere of power felt hollow, as he faced Attorney General Elijah Jennings and two stern-faced DOJ attorneys across his massive mahogany desk. The air in the room seemed heavier than usual, weighted with unspoken accusations. Halbrake straightened his robes, trying to summon the commanding presence that had served him for decades on the bench. His fingers smoothed invisible wrinkles as he cleared his throat. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Attorney General. Questions of jurisdiction are irrelevant," Elijah cut in smoothly, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of steel beneath the professional calm. "When civil rights violations occur in a state court, federal oversight isn't just permitted, it's required." His eyes never wavered from Halbrake's face. One of the DOJ attorneys, a woman with silver-streaked hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing, placed a sleek laptop on the desk with deliberate care. Halbrake's gaze fixed on it, his throat suddenly dry as sandpaper. "Before we discuss jurisdiction," Elijah continued, folding his hands calmly before him, "I'd like you to listen to something." He pressed a button, and a familiar voice filled the room, Halbrake's own, unmistakable in its condescending tone. "Dean, we've handled these situations before. Your boy Hunter, well, children act out sometimes, but there are ways to protect his future." Another voice, Dean Mathers, smooth and confident. "The last thing I need is this showing up in Hunter's record. Not with the governor's education initiative coming up. There's a new kid in his class, quiet type, perfect setup." Elijah stopped the recording with a gentle tap. The silence that followed felt thick enough to cut with a knife. Halbrake's hands gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles white as bone, his wedding ring digging into his finger. "That conversation took place 3 days ago," Elijah said, his calm demeanor masking carefully controlled anger that simmered just beneath the surface. "You and Mr. Mathers deliberately planned to frame an innocent child, my son, to cover up Hunter's documented behavioral issues. You have no right to record private conversations in my chambers," Halbrake sputtered, but his voice lacked conviction, the words falling flat in the oppressive silence. The second DOJ attorney, a younger man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perfectly pressed suit, opened a leather portfolio with methodical precision. "Actually, Your Honor, when those conversations involve conspiracy to violate civil rights, we have every right." His tone was almost apologetic, but his eyes were hard. Elijah leaned forward slightly. But that's just the beginning. He nodded to the female attorney, who produced a thick manila envelope from her briefcase. We've been particularly interested in your relationship with Millstone Juvenile Detention Center. Halbrake's face twitched involuntarily as the attorney spread documents across his desk. Contract papers, financial statements, and a spreadsheet filled with dates and dollar amounts stared up at him like silent witnesses to his corruption. $2,000, Elijah said softly, tapping one figure on the page. That's what you receive for every juvenile you refer to Millstone. Quite a profitable arrangement, especially given your remarkable conviction rate for minority youth. This is a violation of judicial independence, Halbrake stammered, pushing back from his desk, the chair wheels squeaking against the polished floor. You can't just storm in here and… I haven't even started, Elijah interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of promised consequences. Every case you've handled in the past 5 years will be reviewed. Every child you've sentenced without proper representation, every rushed hearing, every deal with Millstone, all of it comes to light now. His words hung in the air, a promise that couldn't be undone. Sweat beaded on Halbrake's forehead, a single drop sliding down his temple. The carefully maintained temperature in his chambers suddenly felt stifling. His eyes darted between the three faces before him, finding no sympathy, no room for negotiation, no escape from what was coming. The younger DOJ attorney placed a document in front of him, sliding it across the polished wood with practiced efficiency. This is the formal dismissal for today's case involving Amir Jennings. You'll sign it now. Halbrake's hand trembled visibly as he reached for his gold fountain pen, a retirement gift from colleagues who had no idea what he really was. The signature he'd wielded so confidently for years came out shaky and uncertain like an old man's scrawl. They moved back to the courtroom where Amir sat waiting with Deshawn, the bailiff who had stayed close to the boy since his father's arrival, offering quiet reassurances and a calming presence. The dismissal was read into the record, each word another nail in the coffin of Halbrake's authority. Case dismissed with prejudice, Halbrake managed to say, unable to meet anyone's eyes, his gaze fixed on the empty space above their heads. The minor is released to his father's custody. As Elijah gathered Amir's belongings, the Thurgood Marshall lunchbox still empty, a painful reminder of the day's injustice, a commotion arose in the hallway. A reporter had somehow gotten wind of the federal presence in the courthouse, her voice carrying through the heavy doors. "Mr. Attorney General," the reporter called out as Elijah and Amir emerged, microphone extended eagerly. "Can you comment on the nature of the DOJ's involvement in Judge Halbrake's court today?" Elijah kept walking, one hand gentle but protective on Amir's shoulder. "No comment at this time," he said firmly, steering them toward the building's side exit where their vehicles waited, their drivers alert and ready. Behind them, Halbrake retreated to his chambers like a wounded animal seeking shelter. His hands shook uncontrollably as he locked the heavy door, something he'd never felt the need to do before. The phone felt unnaturally heavy as he lifted it, dialing a number he knew by heart, fingers missing the buttons twice before connecting. "Dean? They know. It's all coming down." His voice cracked on the last word, the full weight of his situation finally hitting him like a physical blow. Outside in the bright afternoon sun, Amir looked up at his father, squinting against the sudden brightness. After everything that had happened, the false accusation, the night in detention, the confused fear of the courtroom, his question came out small but hopeful. "Can I go home now?" Elijah squeezed his son's shoulder gently, his eyes softening with love and relief. "Yes." He helped Amir into the waiting SUV, then added quietly, with determination hardening his voice, "But tomorrow, we come back. For the truth." The Department of Justice headquarters hummed with late evening activity, its usual bustling corridors now quiet, except for the determined work happening behind closed doors. In a secure conference room on the executive floor, Elijah Jennings sat at the head of a long mahogany table, his suit jacket draped over his chair, and his sleeves rolled up. Around him, his most trusted senior staff pored over documents spread across the table's surface, their faces set with grim determination as the hours ticked by. Just a few feet away, Amir lay curled up on a plush leather couch, his small frame wrapped in a blanket someone had brought from Elijah's office. A half-empty cup of hot cocoa sat on the side table, and his beloved Thurgood Marshall lunchbox rested beside it. Though still in his school clothes from that morning, Amir looked peaceful for the first time since this ordeal began, his chest rising and falling with each gentle breath. Elijah found his gaze drifting to his son every few minutes, each glance strengthening his resolve. The room's warm lighting cast a gentle glow on Amir's sleeping face, making him look even younger than his 6 years. The sight of his boy, vulnerable yet safe in this moment, fueled something fierce and protective in Elijah's chest. "Sir," Sarah, his deputy chief of staff, called softly from her laptop, careful not to disturb the sleeping child. "You need to see this." She turned her screen toward him, showing a series of court documents arranged side by side, her expression troubled. Marcus Thompson, head of the DOJ's criminal division, leaned in, his tie loosened after hours of investigation. The language is identical, word for word, across dozens of cases. His finger traced along highlighted sections of text. "Look at these intake forms. Same phrases, same recommendations, just different names filled in. It's like they didn't even try to hide it." "Copy and paste justice," muttered James Rivera, a veteran civil rights prosecutor with salt and pepper hair and deep worry lines around his eyes. He shuffled through a stack of papers from one of Daryl's boxes. Halbrake didn't even bother changing the wording, just rubber-stamped these kids straight into detention. No consideration for individual circumstances whatsoever. The team worked methodically through the flash drive's contents, with IT specialists ensuring every file was properly preserved for evidence. Each new discovery painted a darker picture of systematic abuse of power, the evidence mounting with every opened folder and examined document. "Got something?" called out Lisa Montgomery, their forensic accountant, her voice cutting through the quiet murmurs in the room. Her fingers flew across her keyboard as she pulled up financial records. Halbrake's investment portfolio includes significant holdings in Millstone Detention Center's parent company, Cornerstone Youth Services. The payments we found earlier, they're just the tip of the iceberg. He's been profiting from this for years. Elijah stood and walked to her station, studying the numbers on her screen, his face hardening. "Show me the timeline." His first investment was made 3 weeks before he started sending kids to Millstone, Lisa explained, pulling up a chart with color-coded data points. His conviction rates for juvenile cases jumped 40% that same month. The correlation is impossible to ignore. It's a clear pattern of judicial misconduct for financial gain. From another corner of the room, Marcus called out, "Chief, there's more." He held up a thick manual labeled Intake Protocols. They built racial profiling right into their system. Look at these risk assessment criteria. It's discrimination codified in their official procedures. The team gathered around as Marcus laid out the documents. The manual's supposedly objective scoring system revealed a clear bias. Black children received automatic aggravating factors for behaviors that were ignored or minimized for white children. The disparity written into the very framework meant to protect them. First-time incidents for black juveniles are flagged as repeat risk automatically, Sarah noted, her voice tight with controlled anger as she pointed to specific sections. The same behaviors in white children are marked as a situational or requiring guidance. It's a dual system designed to funnel certain kids into detention. Elijah picked up one particular case file, his jaw clenching as he read. A 12-year-old girl, honor roll student, sent to Millstone for disruptive behavior during a fire drill. He set the file down carefully, though his hands wanted to shake with barely contained outrage. The white student who pulled the alarm got detention, 3 days in school. She got 3 months in Millstone. The room fell silent except for the soft sound of Amir's steady breathing from the couch. The contrast between his innocent sleep and the corruption they were uncovering felt stark and painful, a reminder of what was truly at stake. James broke the silence, his voice low but firm. This is systematic, coordinated. Halbrake's just the visible part of it. There's a whole network enabling this. The whole system's rigged, Sarah agreed, crossing her arms tightly. From first contact to final sentencing, it's designed to trap certain kids and let others walk free. Elijah stood at the window, looking out at the Washington night sky. The city lights blurred slightly as he focused on his reflection, seeing his son's sleeping form mirrored behind him. He thought of all the parents who hadn't had the power to protect their children from this machinery of injustice, who had watched helplessly as their kids disappeared into a system designed to swallow them. After a long moment, he turned back to his team, determination etched into every line of his face. "Get me a secure line to the Civil Rights Division." As Sarah set up the call, the others continued organizing evidence, their movements precise and purposeful. They all understood the weight of what was coming, the storm they were about to unleash. The phone connection clicked and a familiar voice answered. "Civil Rights Division, Director Wells speaking." "Janet, it's Elijah." He paused, looking once more at his sleeping son. "It's time. We're opening a formal investigation into Jefferson County Juvenile Court under civil rights violations and judicial corruption. I want every resource we have on this." On the couch, Amir shifted slightly in his sleep, his face peaceful and untroubled for the first time since this nightmare began. His small hand clutched the edge of the blanket, and in the soft light, he looked like any other 6-year-old boy, safe and protected as he dreamed, unaware that his ordeal had set in motion something that might change the lives of countless children just like him. The morning sun cast long shadows across Jefferson Elementary's front walkway as Elijah and Amir Jennings approached the main entrance. Amir's small hand was wrapped tightly in his father's larger one, their matching navy blue suits making them look like two versions of the same person. One grown, one still growing. Students arriving for the day stopped and stared. Some parents, dropping off their children, whispered behind raised hands. The usual morning chatter died down to a hushed silence as the Attorney General of the United States walked his 6-year-old son through the school's double doors. Inside the main office, Secretary Mrs. Peters dropped her coffee mug, barely catching it before it hit her desk. Through the glass partition, Principal Langston stood frozen behind his desk, his face draining of color as he watched them approach. "Good morning," Elijah said pleasantly, his voice carrying the same calm authority it held in federal courtrooms. "We're here to formally withdraw Amir from Jefferson Elementary." Mrs. Peters fumbled with withdrawal forms, her hands trembling slightly. Of course, Mr. Jennings. I'll just need you to—" "Attorney General Jennings," Elijah corrected gently but firmly. "And before we proceed with the paperwork, we'll need to review yesterday's security footage." Principal Langston emerged from his office, attempting to project confidence despite his visible discomfort. "Mr. Attorney General Jennings, perhaps we could discuss this in private?" "No need for privacy," Elijah replied. "This is an official request. We'll need to see all surveillance footage from yesterday between 11 a.m. and 2 p.m., particularly around the cubbies in classroom 1B. Amir stood quietly beside his father, his expression serious but calm. He held his Thurgood Marshall lunchbox close to his chest, the same one that had been at the center of yesterday's events. Langston's forced smile faltered. "Our tech director, Mr. Carson, handles all security footage. He's not in yet." "I'm here," a voice called from the hallway. James Carson, a young Asian-American man in khakis and a button-down shirt, stepped into the office. "I saw you coming in. The security system is active in my office." Langston shot Carson a warning look, but the tech director either didn't notice or chose to ignore it. "Would you like to review the footage now?" "Yes, please," Elijah answered, giving Carson an appreciative nod. They followed Carson to his small office filled with computer monitors and humming servers. Amir stayed close to his father, occasionally glancing at the nervous Principal Langston, who trailed behind them like an unwanted shadow. Carson's fingers moved swiftly across his keyboard, pulling up multiple camera views. "We have coverage of most common areas," he explained. "The cubbies are visible from 2 angles." The footage began playing at 11:15 a.m. The hallway was mostly empty, with occasional students passing by. At 11:23, Hunter Mathers appeared on screen, looking carefully around before approaching the row of cubbies. "There," Amir whispered, pointing at the screen. That's when I was drawing, I didn't even move. The video clearly showed Hunter opening Amir's bag, removing the lunchbox, and quickly stuffing it into another student's cubby several spaces down. A teacher, Ms. Roberts, according to her ID badge, walked past during the incident, her attention focused on her phone. Langston shifted uncomfortably as the footage continued, showing the later confrontation where Hunter accused Amir of theft. The camera caught every detail: Hunter's theatrical pointing, the gathering crowd, and most damningly, Ms. Roberts immediately escorting Amir to the office without any investigation. "Please save this footage to a secure drive," Elijah requested, his voice steady despite the anger clearly visible in his eyes. "The Department of Justice will need copies for our civil rights investigation." Carson nodded, already preparing a flash drive. "I'll include the metadata to verify authenticity." Elijah turned to face Langston, who had backed himself against the wall. "I'm filing an immediate civil complaint against Jefferson Elementary for discriminatory conduct and failure to protect a child's rights." He removed a document from his briefcase and handed it to the principal. "This is your copy. The official filing will be registered within the hour." Langston stared at the paper in his hands, his face ashen. "We could discuss this, find another solution." "The time for discussion was yesterday, before you allowed my 6-year-old son to be handcuffed and transported to juvenile detention without even calling his parents." Elijah's voice remained measured, but carried a weight that made everyone in the room stand straighter. "The complaint has been filed. The investigation will proceed." Carson handed over the flash drive containing the footage along with a printed log of the video timestamps. "Everything's documented here, sir." "Thank you for your honesty," Elijah said to Carson. He looked down at Amir, who was studying the frozen image on the screen showing the moment of Hunter's theft. "Ready to go home, son?" Amir nodded, then turned to look at the image one more time. "That's when I was drawing," he repeated softly. "I didn't even move." "The truth always shows up," Elijah responded, squeezing his son's hand. "Even when no one's looking for it." The late morning sun warmed the leather seats of Elijah's government vehicle as they drove toward the Jefferson County Courthouse. Amir sat in the back, his face pressed against the window, watching the familiar streets pass by, though this time he wasn't viewing them through tears or handcuffs. "You sure you want to see it again?" Elijah asked, catching his son's eyes in the rearview mirror. Amir nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It looks different when you're not scared," he said quietly, clutching his Thurgood Marshall lunchbox in his lap. "Like how the dark is less scary when you turn on the lights." Elijah's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, his heart swelling with pride at his son's wisdom and strength. The courthouse came into view, a stark limestone building with towering columns that seemed less imposing in the bright daylight. Yellow daffodils dotted the perfectly maintained lawn, dancing in the spring breeze. As they pulled into the parking lot, Amir spotted a massive oak tree spreading its branches over a corner of the courthouse lawn. Its thick trunk must have been centuries old, its leaves creating a natural canopy that offered shade from the strengthening sun. Under that ancient oak stood Mr. Darrell, the courthouse janitor, in his gray uniform. He wasn't pushing his usual cleaning cart or carrying his ring of keys. Instead, he stood quietly, hands in his pockets, gazing up at the branches as if they held answers to unspoken questions. Elijah parked the car and Amir climbed out, his small dress shoes crunching on the gravel. The boy paused, taking in the building's facade, the same entrance he'd been rushed through yesterday, but now bathed in sunshine instead of shadows. "Hello, Mr. Darrell," Amir called out softly, walking toward the tree with his father close behind. Darrell turned, a gentle smile crossing his weathered face. "Well, if it isn't the brave young man himself," he said, his voice warm and rich like honey. "This here's my thinking spot. Been coming out here for longer than I can remember." "It's a beautiful tree," Elijah observed, reaching out to touch the rough bark. "Must have seen a lot of history." "More than most would care to know," Darrell replied, his expression growing distant. He gestured to a wooden bench nestled between two large roots. "Mind if we sit a spell?" They settled onto the bench, Amir between the two men. Above them, the oak's leaves rustled like whispered conversations, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the grass below. "You know," Daryl began, his eyes fixed on the courthouse steps, "I used to come out here when the days got too heavy inside, watching all those young black boys walk in, so many of them never walking back out." He shook his head slowly. "Started keeping count 5 years ago, then started keeping notes, then started making copies of everything I could get my hands on." Amir listened intently, his small face serious. "Did you tell anybody?" "Oh, I tried," Daryl said, a hint of old pain in his voice. "Tried telling the public defender's office, tried telling some reporters, even wrote letters to the state Supreme Court." He gave a soft, sad chuckle. "But who's gonna listen to an old janitor with a bunch of handwritten notes?" "I would have listened," Amir said firmly, making both men turn to look at him. Daryl's eyes grew misty. "That's because you've got a good heart, young man. And a brave one, too." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth stone. "Found this under this very tree my first week on the job. Been carrying it ever since, reminding me to keep watching, keep writing things down, even when nobody seemed to care." He placed the stone in Amir's small palm. It was dark gray with a single stripe of white quartz running through it like a lightning bolt. "Sometimes," Daryl continued, "doing the right thing means standing alone for a long time, waiting for the moment when truth can finally break through. Like water wearing down a stone, slow and steady, but it gets there in the end." Amir turned the stone over in his hands, tracing the white line with his finger. "Is that why you helped me? Because you were waiting for the truth?" "Partly," Daryl admitted, "but mostly because I couldn't bear to see another bright young spirit dimmed by that place." He gestured toward the courthouse. "When I saw your daddy walk in yesterday, I knew the time had finally come. Sometimes the truth just needs the right moment and the right people to be heard." Suddenly, Amir stood up and wrapped his arms around Daryl's neck in a tight hug. "Thank you for saving me," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Daryl gently pulled back, kneeling down to meet Amir's eyes. "You just keep being brave," he said softly. "That's how we win. That's how we make sure no more children have to walk through those doors alone." Elijah stood quietly, placing his hand on the ancient oak's bark. His fingers traced the deep grooves and patterns carved by time and weather. "This tree's seen more truth than that bench inside," he said thoughtfully, looking up at the sprawling canopy above them. They stood there in silence, 3 generations united under the oak's protective shade, as the morning sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting gentle shadows on the courthouse lawn. The mahogany-paneled office gleamed under soft lamplight as Dean Mathers paced back and forth, his expensive leather shoes wearing a path in the plush carpet. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Washington, D.C. Nighttime skyline twinkled, but Dean barely noticed the view. His usually perfectly pressed suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened at his neck, and beads of sweat dotted his hairline despite the room's perfect temperature. "This is a disaster, Richard," he muttered to his lawyer, Richard Blackwood, who sat calmly behind an imposing desk. "The Attorney General himself? How did we not know his kid was in that school?" His voice cracked with barely contained panic. Richard adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, maintaining his professional composure despite the late hour. The clock on the wall showed nearly midnight. The school directory listed his mother's maiden name. There was no way to anticipate this level of complication. He spoke with practiced steadiness, a stark contrast to his client's growing hysteria. Dean stopped pacing and slumped into a leather chair across from Richard. His face looked drawn, aged by stress, the lines around his mouth deeper than they'd been just days ago. "Halbrake called earlier. He's threatening to talk if they push him hard enough." He ran trembling fingers through his graying hair, disheveling it further. "Everything we've done, it'll all come out." The fear in his eyes was raw, unfiltered. Richard opened a thick file folder on his desk, scanning through documents with practiced efficiency. The yellow legal pads were filled with notes in his meticulous handwriting. "Let's review the situation systematically. How many incidents are we talking about?" Dean's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, as if the walls themselves might be listening. 8, maybe 9. I lost count after a while. He pulled out a monogrammed handkerchief and dabbed at his forehead, the silk coming away damp. It started 2 years ago when Hunter pushed that Martinez boy down the stairs. The kid broke his arm in 3 places. The sound... He shuddered visibly. I can still hear it sometimes. And that's when you first approached Judge Halbrake? Richard's pen hovered over his notepad, ready to document every damning detail. Yes, Hunter was already on thin ice after the incident with the Williams girl's hijab. I couldn't let another violent outburst go on his record. Dean's voice cracked slightly, a mixture of parental protection and self-preservation evident in every word. Halbrake suggested we could redirect the blame, make it look like Martinez attacked Hunter first. The school cameras had a convenient blind spot. Richard made careful notes in precise handwriting, his face betraying nothing of his personal thoughts on the matter. And the other incidents? There was the Thompson boy's backpack that Hunter destroyed. We planted evidence that Thompson had been stealing from other students. The Rodriguez twins' science project that Hunter sabotaged. We made it look like they had cheated. Dean's words came faster now, like a confession he couldn't hold back, years of guilt spilling over in a torrent. The Jackson boys' lunch money, the Ahmed girls' art supplies, the Wilson boys' phone. Hunter just couldn't stop himself. All blamed on the victims themselves, Richard finished, his pen scratching against paper. The sound filled the otherwise silent room like an accusation. Hunter needed help, Dean said defensively, but his voice wavered with the hollow ring of excuses. He still needs help. But if this gets out, my whole family will be destroyed. The business, our reputation, everything I've built. His hands gripped the armrests until his knuckles turned white. Richard leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. The racial pattern is problematic. Every child who took the fall was either black or Latino. The civil rights implications alone. He let the thought hang in the air between them, heavy with unspoken consequences. I didn't choose them because of that, Dean protested, but his eyes shifted away, unable to meet his lawyer's steady gaze. It just worked out that way. Halbrake said they were more believable targets, that no one would question. Stop. Richard held up a hand, his expression hardening for the first time. Don't finish that sentence, not with me. He pulled out a fresh legal pad from his drawer with a decisive snap. We need to focus on damage control. The DOJ has evidence, witnesses, and now they have Halbrake cornered. Our only play is to get ahead of this. Dean leaned forward eagerly, hope flickering across his haggard features. Yes, exactly. There must be something we can offer them. Everyone has a price, right? Even the Attorney General? Richard's expression remained neutral, professional, though something cold flickered behind his eyes. Not exactly, but we can propose a settlement that might appeal to his broader goals. He began writing quickly, the scratch of his pen urgent. A public apology. Carefully worded, of course. A substantial donation to youth legal aid programs. Say, $5 million? Your immediate resignation from all public boards and committees? $5 million? Dean's face reddened, his momentary vulnerability replaced by indignation. That's outrageous. I can't possibly. A bargain compared to what this will cost you if it goes public. Richard cut in smoothly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Think of the civil suits alone. Every family whose child was wrongly accused. The hate crime enhancements. The conspiracy charges. The media coverage. He let each point land like a hammer blow, watching Dean shrink with each one. $5 million is a small price for silence. For your son's future. Dean slumped further in his chair, defeated. His shoulders sagged as the full weight of his actions settled upon them. Write it up. Whatever it takes. The fight had drained from his voice entirely. Richard worked late into the night, crafting the careful language of the proposal. Each paragraph was a masterwork of legal precision, offering restitution while admitting no specific wrongdoing. The document promised change while protecting Dean from prosecution. Coffee cups accumulated on his desk as the hours passed, the night deepening around him. Morning light was just beginning to streak the sky when Richard's assistant delivered the proposal to the Department of Justice. It arrived on Elijah Jennings' desk along with his morning coffee, steam rising from both the envelope and the cup. Elijah sat at his desk, his posture perfect despite the early hour, as he read through the offered settlement. His expression remained completely neutral, not a flicker of emotion crossing his face as he absorbed each carefully worded clause. His fingers, steady and deliberate, turned each page with the same care he might give evidence in a capital case. His assistant hovered nearby, clipboard in hand, waiting for instructions. "Sir, should I prepare a response?" Her voice was professional, but curiosity tinged the edges. Elijah looked up from the document, his eyes sharp and clear as cut diamonds. The morning light caught the silver at his temples, illuminating the quiet dignity in his bearing. "Yes," he said calmly, placing the document down with finality. "Make sure the cameras are rolling when I reject it." There was no anger in his voice, only the steady resolve of justice long overdue. The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of the Department of Justice headquarters as reporters gathered in growing numbers. Camera crews jostled for position, their equipment creating a forest of microphones and lenses. The usual morning bustle of Washington, D.C. seemed to pause around this focal point of anticipation. Sarah from the Washington Post checked her phone again, scrolling through fragmentary tips and unconfirmed reports. "Anyone get anything solid?" she asked her colleague from the Times. "Just whispers," he replied, adjusting his tie. "Something about a judge down in Jefferson County, civil rights violations. But there's more. Something personal about the AG himself." The crowd of journalists buzzed with speculation. Veteran reporters who'd covered the DOJ for decades couldn't remember the last time there'd been such an urgent press call. The notice had gone out just an hour ago, marked priority coverage requested. Inside the building's marble lobby, staffers moved with practiced efficiency, checking credentials and guiding media personnel through security. The press room, usually spacious enough for routine briefings, quickly filled beyond capacity. Television lights created artificial day, and the low murmur of dozens of conversations filled the air. A young DOJ aide arranged easels covered with black cloth near the podium. Each concealed shape suggested charts or photos underneath. The mysterious displays only fueled the reporter's curiosity. At precisely 9 a.m., the side door opened. Elijah Jennings entered, followed by a team of attorneys from the Civil Rights Division. His presence commanded immediate attention, not through any theatrical gesture, but through the quiet authority he carried. His dark suit was impeccable, his expression composed but determined. He approached the podium with measured steps, adjusting the microphone with a practiced hand. The room fell silent. "Good morning," he began, his voice clear and steady. "Today, the Department of Justice is announcing a federal investigation into systemic civil rights violations within the Jefferson County juvenile court system." Camera shutters clicked rapidly as he gestured to an aide, who removed the first black cloth. A graph appeared, showing stark racial disparities in juvenile detention rates. "Over the past 5 years," Elijah continued, "we have documented a pattern of discriminatory practices that cannot be explained by any legitimate factor." Another cloth was removed, revealing a wall of redacted case files. These represent children, predominantly Black and Latino, who were processed through this system without proper representation, without due process, and often without their parents even being notified. He paused, allowing the information to settle. The room remained unusually still, reporters sensing that something bigger was coming. "The investigation has uncovered evidence of judicial misconduct by Judge Leonard Halbrake, including financial kickbacks from private juvenile detention facilities." A third display showed complex financial diagrams linking court decisions to monetary transfers. For each child sentenced to these facilities, money changed hands. Elijah's voice remained professional, but those who knew him could detect the controlled anger underneath. "We have also discovered evidence of collaboration between the judge and certain influential community members to deliberately target minority children, using false accusations to cover up incidents involving other students." The reporters began to shift in their seats, pens moving frantically across notepads. This was already a major story, but they could sense there was more. Elijah straightened slightly, his hands resting lightly on the podium. This investigation began when one such case came to light in a particularly personal way. He paused, and for the first time, emotion flickered across his face. One of the victims was my son, Amir Jennings, age 6. The room erupted in gasps and hurried whispers. Cameras flashed in rapid succession. Several reporters stood up, questions already forming on their lips, but Elijah raised a hand for silence. The final cloth was removed. There, enlarged on professional display boards, were the photos: small hands in oversized handcuffs, a security camera still frame showing a child being led to a police car, a scared 6-year-old alone in a detention cell. My son was accused of theft at his school, Elijah continued, his voice now carrying an edge of controlled pain. Without investigation, without contacting his parents, school officials called police. He was handcuffed, transported to a juvenile facility, and held overnight, all before anyone attempted to reach his family. The aide started a video on a large screen. The grainy security footage from the school showed a clear sequence: Hunter Mathers taking Amir's lunch, hiding it, then pointing accusingly at Amir when teachers arrived. This was not an isolated incident, Elijah said as the video played. This was part of a pattern, a system that presumed guilt based on the color of a child's skin. A system that saw children as profit opportunities rather than human beings deserving of protection and due process. Questions burst forth from the assembled press corps. Attorney General, how long was your son detained? Was there any investigation before arrest? Did Judge Hallbreak know who Amir was? What actions will be taken against the school? Elijah raised his hand again, commanding silence with that simple gesture. His voice, when he spoke again, carried the weight of both personal pain and professional purpose. This isn't about one child, he said, each word clear and deliberate. It's about hundreds who were silenced. That silence ends today. The press room erupted again with questions, but Elijah had already stepped back from the podium. His team began distributing detailed press packets as he exited through the side door. Up in his office, Amir sat in his father's large leather chair, watching the press conference on a wall-mounted screen. His expression was solemn but understanding, more understanding than any 6-year-old should need to be. He hadn't wanted to attend the press conference in person, preferring to watch from this familiar, safe space. As the cameras showed his father walking away from the podium, Amir sat up straighter in the chair. His small face reflected a mixture of emotions: pride in his father, lingering hurt from his experience, and something else. A growing awareness that his story might help other kids who didn't have someone as powerful as his dad to speak for them. Hunter Mathers sat rigidly in the hard plastic chair outside the counselor's office, his shoulders hunched as if trying to make himself invisible. The usual bustle of the school hallway had taken on a different tone today. Whispers followed him like shadows, and students walked wide circles around him when passing by. Through the frosted glass window of the office door, he could see the shapes of his parents arguing with Principal Langston. Their voices were muffled, but their agitated gestures told the story clearly enough. His mother's designer handbag swung wildly as she jabbed her finger at something on Langston's desk. The morning news was still playing on repeat in Hunter's mind. He'd watched it over breakfast, footage of himself on the school security camera, taking Amir's lunch, hiding it, then pointing the finger of blame. His face had been blurred out, but everyone knew, the whole world knew. Mrs. Chen, the school counselor, opened her door and gave him a gentle smile. "Hunter, would you like to come in now?" He stood up slowly, his legs feeling heavy. The counselor's office looked different today, smaller somehow, despite its familiar decorations of motivational posters and children's artwork. Hunter sank into the oversized armchair where he'd sat many times before, usually after incidents that his parents had smoothed over. "Would you like some water?" Mrs. Chen asked, settling into her chair across from him. Hunter shook his head. His throat felt too tight to swallow anything. "We don't have to talk right away," she said, her voice calm and measured. "We can just sit here for a while if you prefer." The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Outside, a group of kids passed by, their laughter muffled through the closed door. Hunter stared at his hands, noticing how his knuckles had turned white from gripping the armrests. Minutes passed. Mrs. Chen didn't push, didn't prod. She simply sat there, occasionally making notes in her folder, giving Hunter space to process. Finally, his voice barely above a whisper, Hunter asked the question that had been haunting him since the news broke. "Am I going to jail?" Mrs. Chen set down her pen. "No, Hunter, you're not going to jail." She leaned forward slightly. "But there will be consequences, and you will need to answer some questions about what happened, not just with Amir, but about other incidents as well." Hunter's stomach clenched. He knew what she meant, all the times he'd gotten away with things, all the times other kids had taken the blame. It hadn't seemed real before, like it was all just a game. But now, seeing Amir in handcuffs on the news, it felt terrifyingly real. A commotion outside drew their attention. Hunter's mother's voice carried through the door, high-pitched and desperate. "You have to do something. He's just a child. The media is crucifying him." Mrs. Chen stood up. "Excuse me for a moment, Hunter." Through the crack in the door as she left, Hunter could see his mother, mascara streaking down her face, clutching Principal Langston's arm. "Please," she begged. "You have to protect him. You've always protected him before." But something had changed. Ms. Rodriguez, Hunter's third-grade teacher, stepped forward from a group of staff members who had gathered. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Mathers, but we can't stay silent anymore." Her voice was firm but sad. "Last year, Hunter pushed Emma Thompson down the stairs, but you convinced everyone she tripped. The month before that, he stole Marcus Wilson's project and destroyed it. But somehow Marcus got detention for lying about it." Other teachers began speaking up one after another, like a dam breaking. Each had a story, an incident, a moment when they'd seen something but said nothing. Hunter's mother's face crumpled as the truth spilled out around her. Back in the counselor's office, Hunter could hear it all. Each story hit him like a physical blow, making him sink deeper into the chair. He remembered every incident they described, remembered how easy it had been to get away with it all, how his father would make a few calls, how problems would just disappear. Later that afternoon, Hunter sat at his desk in his bedroom, surrounded by expensive toys and games that had always been his rewards for keeping quiet about things. The setting sun cast strange shadows across his face as he stared at his reflection in the small mirror on his desk. He barely recognized himself. Was that what everyone else saw when they looked at him? A bully? A liar? His father had always told him he was special, that rules were for other people, that their family was above consequences. Now those words rang hollow in his memory. His eyes drifted to the corner of his desk where Amir's Thurgood Marshall lunchbox sat, the one he'd taken that day, the one that had started all of this. He'd kept it, hidden it away like a trophy. Now it seemed to mock him, the face of the famous justice staring back with stern disapproval. Hunter picked up the lunchbox, feeling its weight in his hands. For the first time, he really looked at the image on its surface. A dignified black man in judicial robes, someone who had fought for justice and truth, the complete opposite of everything Hunter had done. Moving like someone in a dream, Hunter stood up and walked downstairs to the kitchen. The house was quiet. His parents were still out, probably meeting with lawyers or damage control specialists. The kitchen lights were off, but there was enough evening light filtering through the windows to see by. The garbage can stood in the corner, its lid slightly ajar. Hunter approached it slowly, the lunchbox growing heavier with each step. He stood there for a long moment, holding the evidence of his cruelty, his privilege, his unearned power over others. Then, with a quiet decisiveness that felt foreign to him, Hunter lifted the lid and dropped the lunchbox into the trash. The soft thud it made as it hit the bottom seemed to echo in the empty kitchen, a small sound marking a massive shift in his young life. He stood there, staring down at the discarded lunchbox, knowing that this small act of contrition wasn't nearly enough to make up for what he'd done. But it was a start. Perhaps his first honest action in a very long time. The community center buzzed with quiet energy as families filed in, their faces a mix of hope and lingering pain. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, warming the worn wooden floors of the meeting room. Daryl stood by the door, greeting each family with a gentle nod, his weathered hands clasping theirs in silent understanding. His eyes held a quiet determination that had been building for years. Amir sat next to his father at a long table, his small fingers tracing patterns on the surface. His toy gavel, a gift from his father after the hearing, lay before him. Sometimes he would touch it gently, as if drawing strength from the symbol. Elijah had brought a stack of legal notepads and several DOJ folders, but his attention remained focused on the families gathering before them. He made eye contact with each person who entered, offering a reassuring smile that promised they would be heard. "Thank you all for coming," Daryl said, his voice soft but carrying across the room. "These people here, they want to listen. Really listen." He gestured to Elijah and Amir. "They understand what happened to your children because it happened to them too." His hands trembled slightly, betraying the emotion behind his carefully measured words. A woman in a faded blue dress stood first, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. "My son Marcus, he was 9. She paused, gathering strength. "He raised his hand in class, asked to use the bathroom. The teacher said no. He asked again, said it was an emergency. She called security, said he was being threatening." Her voice caught on the last word, as if she still couldn't believe it. Amir's eyes widened as she continued. "They put him in handcuffs right there in the classroom, took him straight to Halbrake's court. I didn't even know until hours later." Tears welled in her eyes. 3 days in juvenile detention for asking to use the bathroom. She clutched her purse tightly, knuckles white with tension, and remembered fear. Elijah made careful notes, his pen moving steadily across the paper. "Ms. Thompson will need to review Marcus's case files. A DOJ attorney will work directly with you to ensure full documentation." His voice was professional but warm, offering both compassion and concrete action. Another parent stepped forward, clutching a small pink backpack to her chest like a shield. "My daughter Keisha, 7 years old." Her voice cracked. "In the lunch line, she took an extra milk carton, said she was still thirsty. The cafeteria worker called the resource officer. She stroked the backpack absently, as if comforting the child who wasn't there. The pink backpack, Amir noticed, still had a detention center property tag attached to it. The bright yellow plastic tag stood out harshly against the sparkly unicorn design. The mother saw him looking and explained, "She won't let me take it off. Says it proves she was there, that she's not making it up." She blinked rapidly, fighting back fresh tears. More stories followed, each one hitting harder than the last. A 10-year-old boy detained for loitering while waiting for his mother after school. An 8-year-old girl charged with disturbing the peace for crying too loudly when she fell on the playground. The room grew heavy with shared pain, but also with a growing sense of solidarity. Near the back of the room, a quiet boy about Amir's age sat with his mother. His eyes kept darting to the exit, as if checking his escape route. He wore a clean but slightly too large button-up shirt, the sleeves folded back twice. When they finally stood to speak, the mother had to keep her hand on his shoulder to steady him. "This is Malik," she said. "He spent 5 days in detention last month. They told him—" She stopped, fighting back tears. "They told my baby I didn't want him anymore, that I wasn't coming back." Her fingers tightened protectively on his shoulder. Malik spoke then, his voice barely above a whisper. "But she did come back. They lied." He looked directly at Amir for the first time. "They lie about everything." His words were simple, but carried the weight of a truth he'd learned too young. Amir felt a connection with Malik, saw in his eyes the same fear, the same confusion he'd experienced. The look they shared contained an understanding no words could capture. Without saying anything, he picked up his toy gavel and walked over to Malik. "You can use it till you're out," Amir said, holding out the gavel. "It helps remember the good kind of justice." His voice was soft but sure, offering not just the toy but a small piece of hope. Malik took the gavel carefully as if it might break. A small smile broke through his worried expression, his eyes shining with unexpected joy at the gesture. His fingers wrapped around the handle, testing its weight and solidity. Elijah watched this exchange silently, his heart swelling with pride at his son's compassion. In that moment, He saw the man his boy might become, someone who understood that healing could begin with the smallest of gestures. Later that evening, after meeting with each family individually and arranging follow-up appointments with DOJ attorneys, he sat at his desk and opened his journal. In careful handwriting, he wrote, "Justice isn't just restoring what was taken, it's restoring what was lost, hope." He paused, pen hovering over the page, then added, "And today, I saw my son understand that better than most grown men ever will." Judge Leonard Halbrake sat alone in his chambers, the morning light casting long shadows across his mahogany desk. The office that had once felt like his personal kingdom now seemed to close in around him, the walls holding secrets he could no longer contain. His normally pristine suit jacket hung wrinkled on the back of his chair, his tie loosened at his neck. On the muted television mounted in the corner, an old interview played. The younger version of himself stood at a podium, chest puffed with pride as he spoke about maintaining order and teaching discipline to wayward youth. The words now rang hollow in his ears. His phone hadn't rung all morning. No clerk had knocked with case files. No prosecutor had stopped by to discuss the day's proceedings. The silence spoke volumes. His staff moved through the outer office like ghosts, their footsteps hushed, their eyes finding sudden interest in the floor whenever he appeared in the doorway. Halbrake's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup, the liquid inside long since gone cold. On his desk, a framed photo showed him receiving an award for excellence in juvenile justice. He turned it face down, unable to look at it anymore. The morning newspaper lay unopened on his desk, but he knew what was inside. Another exposé, another revelation about his dealings with the private detention centers. The evidence kept mounting, each day bringing new witnesses forward, new documents surfacing. Mr. Darrell's meticulous records had opened a floodgate that couldn't be closed. Through his window, he watched as black SUVs pulled into the courthouse parking lot. His heart rate quickened, but he didn't move. There was nowhere left to run. A soft knock came at his door. His secretary, Linda, who had worked for him for 15 years, poked her head in. Her voice was barely audible. "Judge Halbrake? There are some people here to see you." He nodded, straightening his tie with shaking fingers. "Send them in, Linda." But Linda had already stepped away, replaced by the solid presence of federal agents in dark suits. Deshawn, the young bailiff who had stood guard in his courtroom countless times, appeared behind them. For the first time since he'd started working at the courthouse, Deshawn didn't announce the judge's presence or stand at attention. Instead, the bailiff simply gave a quiet nod to the DOJ agents. His face showed no emotion, but his eyes held a mix of sadness and resolution. This was justice being served, even if it didn't feel triumphant. Leonard Halbrake, one of the agents, stepped forward, his badge gleaming. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest." Halbrake's shoulders slumped as the agent read the charges. Racketeering, fraud, abuse of authority, and federal civil rights violations. Each charge landed like a physical blow, stripping away the layers of authority he'd hidden behind for so long. "You have the right to remain silent," the agent continued, moving behind the desk with handcuffs ready. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The metal clicked around Halbrake's wrists, cold and final. The sound echoed in the chamber where he had once wielded so much power. As they led him toward the door, he caught a glimpse of himself in the window reflection, his face ashen, his posture defeated. The walk through the courthouse corridors felt endless. Each step took him past familiar faces that now turned away, past walls that held memories of his corrupted authority. The handcuffs bit into his wrists, a constant reminder of all the children he'd ordered restrained in his courtroom. As they approached courtroom 3B, where he had presided over countless juvenile cases, three figures stood quietly in the hallway. Elijah Jennings, tall and dignified in his suit, stood with his hand resting protectively on Amir's shoulder. Next to them, Mr. Darrell watched with quiet satisfaction, his years of careful documentation finally bearing fruit. Amir's eyes followed the procession, taking in the sight of the man who had tried to sentence him without cause. But there was no fear in his gaze now, no confusion or hurt. Instead, he looked at Halbrake with something close to curiosity. He looked smaller now, Amir observed softly, looking up at his father. Elijah squeezed his son's shoulder gently and nodded. That's what the truth does. Amir's hand found his father's, their fingers interlocking. A small smile played across the boy's face. Not one of victory or revenge, but of peace. The kind of peace that comes with knowing that right had prevailed, that justice had finally found its way into these halls. The agents continued their steady march toward the exit, Halbrake's footsteps echoing in the marble corridor. Deshawn followed behind, his posture straight, his duty now aligned with his conscience. The morning sun streamed through the high windows, casting long rays across the courthouse floor, illuminating the path toward justice. The cherry blossoms danced on the spring breeze, their delicate pink petals drifting across the Jefferson County Courthouse lawn. The old oak tree, which had witnessed decades of injustice, now stood sentinel over a very different scene. Beneath its spreading branches, a crowd gathered around a covered plaque, their faces bright with anticipation and purpose. Rows of white chairs filled the courthouse lawn, occupied by families whose lives had been touched by Judge Halbrake's corrupt reign. Community leaders sat shoulder to shoulder with DOJ staff members, while reporters positioned their cameras at strategic angles. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grass, and a gentle warmth filled the air with promise. In the front row, Amir Jennings sat straight-backed in his navy suit, his small hands folded neatly in his lap. The suit was new, chosen specially for this occasion, and he wore it with quiet dignity. His eyes kept drifting to the covered plaque, curiosity evident in his expression. He looked different now, more confident, more settled in himself. The fear that had once shadowed his face had been replaced by something stronger: purpose. Next to him sat Mr. Darrell, dressed in his Sunday best, his usual janitor's uniform replaced by a pressed shirt and tie. He kept adjusting his collar, unused to the formality, but his eyes shone with pride. Several rows behind them, familiar faces from the DOJ watched with professional satisfaction as their months of work culminated in this moment. The small stage, decorated with simple bunting and patriotic colors, stood ready. A podium waited at its center, the Department of Justice seal catching the morning light. The crowd's quiet murmur fell to silence as Elijah Jennings approached the stage, his steps measured and deliberate. He stood at the podium, his presence commanding yet gentle. The microphone picked up his steady breathing before he began to speak. 3 months ago, we uncovered a truth that had been buried beneath years of silence, he began, his voice carrying across the lawn. But this gathering isn't about vengeance. It's about rebuilding trust, brick by brick, case by case, heart by heart. His words hung in the air, weighted with meaning. The crowd listened intently as he continued. This plaque represents more than just a memorial. It stands as a promise to every child who walks through these courthouse doors. You will be heard. You will be seen. You will be treated with the dignity that is your birthright. Elijah paused, his eyes finding his son in the front row. And now, I'd like to invite someone special to the stage. Someone whose courage helped shine a light on the darkness. My son, Amir. Amir stood carefully, straightening his jacket. In his hand, he held the wooden gavel that had become a symbol of his journey. His steps were steady as he climbed the stage stairs, each movement deliberate and composed. He stood beside his father at the podium, having to stretch slightly to reach the microphone. For a moment, he just stood there, looking out at the sea of faces. Then, with a clarity that carried across the lawn, he spoke. I didn't steal anything, but they took something from me anyway. He lifted the gavel, holding it high. Now I get to take something back. Fairness. The crowd fell completely silent. The only sound was the rustle of cherry blossom petals in the breeze. Then, as if a dam had broken, applause erupted across the lawn. In the front row, Mr. Darrell reached up to wipe away a tear that had escaped down his cheek. Beside him, Malik and the other children who had been wrongfully detained sat beaming, their faces glowing with vindication and hope. Parents hugged their children closer. DOJ staff members exchanged knowing looks. Reporters' cameras clicked rapidly, capturing the moment when a small boy's voice spoke truth to power. The applause continued, washing over the courthouse lawn in waves as if trying to cleanse away the echoes of past injustices. Later that evening, as the sun began to set over Washington, D.C., Amir walked into his father's home office. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes widening at what he saw. There, on his father's desk, sat a miniature judge's bench, perfectly sized for a child. The wood gleamed in the evening light, and when he stepped closer, he could see his name engraved in elegant letters across the front. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail carefully considered. A small note card propped against it read, "From Mr. Darrell and the families. May justice always have a home with you." Above the bench, newly hung on the wall, was Amir's own artwork, a drawing he had made of Thurgood Marshall shaking hands with a child, the lines simple but full of meaning. Amir approached the bench slowly, taking in every detail. He climbed onto the stool that had been placed behind it, his movements careful and reverent. The wooden gavel felt natural in his hand as he placed it on the small sound block. Sitting up straight, he cleared his throat and spoke with quiet authority. "Court is now in session." Elijah stood in the doorway watching his son with quiet pride. He made no move to interrupt, understanding the significance of this moment. The last rays of sunlight streamed through the window, casting a golden glow around Amir as he sat at his bench, no longer a victim of the system, but a voice for change. The system had tried to silence him. Instead, it gave him a voice stronger than ever. If you enjoyed the story of Amir and Elijah, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.